You unlock this podcast with the key of imagination. Beyond it is another dimension. A dimension of magic, a dimension of dreams, a dimension of Disney. You're moving into a realm of both wonder and fantasy, of news and ideas. You've just crossed over into Disney Coast to Coast.
Hey folks, and welcome to Disney Coast to Coast, the ultimate unofficial Disney fan podcast. I'm Jeff DePaoli, and today on the show I have Jason Surrell joining me to discuss the never-ending conversation about intellectual property use in the Disney parks. Jason worked for many years at Walt Disney Imagineering and has written numerous Disney books with topics including Pirates of the Caribbean, The Haunted Mansion, the Disney Mountains, and more, so he certainly has a first-hand experience with today's topic of conversation. I had a fantastic time chatting with Jason and really appreciate his insight. It's all coming your way right after this. Frank, Ollie, Mark, Milt, Les, Ward, Eric, John, and Wooly. If you're a Disney history buff like myself, these 9 names should sound familiar to you. These are the names of Walt Disney's 9 old men, the core animators at the studio who worked directly with Walt Disney. Magically inspired apparel shop Who's It's and What's It's recently launched a new product honoring these key animators with a 9 old pencil set with each of their names gold foil stamped into the side of 9 pencils. I find this to be such a clever idea and fell in love with it the moment I saw it. You can order your 9 old pencil set right now over at whositswhatsits.com, and you'll even save 15% off your entire order by simply using the code DCTC at checkout. So head on over to whositswhatsits.com, spelled like whositswhatsits.com, or click the link in this episode's description, and don't forget to use code DCTC to save 15% off of anything and everything you order on the site.
It's time to dive into today's Disney dialogue.
Hello, Jason, and welcome to Disney Coast to Coast. An absolute pleasure to have you here today. Thanks for joining me.
Well, it is a pleasure to be here. I enjoy the show, and it's an honor to finally get a chance to come on and talk to you.
Yes, thank you. And today we're talking about intellectual properties used in the Disney parks. But before we jump into that conversation, why don't you let the listeners know a little bit about your background in the theme park industry?
Well, at this point, I'm coming up on, actually this month, 30 years in the theme park industry. I've worked for one of 2 companies for that entire time up until recently, the Walt Disney Company and Universal Studios. The majority of that time has been with Disney, 15 years at Walt Disney Imagineering as a writer, producer, and creative director, along with an additional 4 or 5 years at Disney Creative Entertainment, live entertainment. I would say a good part of my career has been spent in live entertainment, but the majority has been in attractions, primarily at Walt Disney Imagineering. So, hitting that not so magical 30-year mark, and I'm feeling it, buddy.
Well, our first interaction actually took place when I wrote an article for Attractions magazine about how I miss the days of being introduced to things in theme parks instead of simply being fed what's trendy at the moment. Now, one of my biggest examples in this article was the old Alfred Hitchcock, The Art of Making Movies attraction at Universal Studios, Florida. And you, I guess, apparently read the article and shared it on your Facebook and told essentially your friends in the industry, hey, check this out. It obviously hit a nerve with you. And I'm curious, what was it in that article that really made you stop for a moment?
Well, the big thing, I think, was the specific example you used, the Alfred Hitchcock, The Art of Making Movies. I, to this day, think that is one of the greatest live shows that's ever been produced for a theme park, but primarily in the area of the sort of making of story, which has fallen out of favor in the past decade or so, largely due to an increasingly sophisticated audience who knows how films are made. When a lot of these parks first opened, Disney MGM Studios, Universal Studios Florida, this was before the days of DVDs and widespread special features, some of the more in-depth making of segments on Entertainment Tonight and Access Hollywood. So you really had more of an appetite for that kind of storytelling in theme parks because the average guest really didn't know what went into the making of films and television shows. And then as time passed and people got more and more into the documentaries and special features and everything else, it really became more a matter of the guests wanting to live the adventures as opposed to seeing how they were made. So when you wrote a very affectionate, celebratory piece about the Hitchcock show in particular, it really spoke to me. And I thought, oh my God, this guy gets it. And it shows that there very well could still be an audience out there for this type of experience. I'm of the opinion that there is, and if it were done well, and told the right story, it would still hold a lot of appeal for people.
Yeah, there's a lot to dissect here, but before we get any further, people throw around that term IP a lot. And can you just define it real quickly, what it means exactly to folks who may not quite understand IP when they hear it so often?
Yeah, absolutely. It's one of those terms that gets thrown around now, not only in the industry, but by even the average person who likes to sound like they're in the know. But IP stands for intellectual property, specifically the characters and stories that were developed by these individual companies, especially those that own theme parks. And the importance of IP in that regard is that is something that, due to the fact that they created it, is completely unique to them and off the table to anybody else in the industry, which would make your property unique in the world in terms of some of the characters and stories that it presents. And obviously, Walt Disney invented that market with Disneyland being the world's first theme park. And he was the first to realize the importance of IP long before it was referred to that way. And honestly, one of my favorite stories involves a meeting he was having with some of his designers, and I believe some of the operational folks from Disneyland were there. And the subject of the costume characters came up, and one of the folks at the meeting sort of dismissed it as though it wasn't important or there were greater things to discuss. And Walt called a halt to the meeting, brought the whole thing to a standstill, and said, "Now look, this is where we got to make one thing clear. Our competitors, other parks, can have amazing new rides. They can try to copy those. They can keep their parks as clean as we keep Disneyland. There are a lot of things they can copy to try to compete with us. But the one thing they don't have access to and will never have access to are those characters." And his point was, don't ever sell that short, because even from the earliest days, he knew that was the key differentiator between Disneyland and any and everything else in the world.
It's so fascinating that you say that. And, we're going to talk about how, more currently IP has become such a big thing in the theme parks. But it is so interesting, specifically about characters. When you think of like the opening of Epcot, of course, that was, a long time ago at this point, or even Disney California Adventure, when they're like, we're going to open these parks, and these parks aren't going to have the traditional Disney characters in them. Like, that's something you always hear about the early days of those parks. And it's just the complete opposite of how they are today, where it's like, no, character everywhere. But at one point they're like, no, let's take them away. And then the public was like, no, we really want those characters. So they end up getting thrown in there. So that's really interesting as well.
It is interesting. And, I obviously was still a kid when Epcot opened, but anecdotally, I would hear reasons for that, for not including the characters. One, I think they were legitimately trying to do something different with Epcot. something arguably a little bit more adult, certainly more educational and enriching. All of the things that you think about when you think about Epcot Center and what it was originally designed to do. And then I also secondarily think that there was the potential concern for cannibalization. They wanted to make sure that, because they really didn't know how things were going to go. That was the second theme park at Walt Disney World. So obviously, this was new territory for them at the time. And I think on some level, they wanted to preserve the Magic Kingdom experience to ensure that people kept going there. I mean, looking back on it now, it's like, it's the most heavily attended park in the world. What are you worried about? But back then they didn't know. So I think part of it was an effort to differentiate. Part of it was I think the vision that they had for Epcot Center. And those two things taken together, I think all contributed to the decision. But I think that what the message they got from guests was simply, we love the Disney characters. It's one of the reasons we come here, and we want to see them everywhere. And, to their credit, they didn't just dump the characters into the park. They appeared in themed, appropriate ways, in futuristic dress in Future World. I know a little something about that myself from my early days in Disney entertainment. And then in World Showcase, where initially some of the standard characters were given appropriate dress based on the country that they appeared in. And then later, as time went on, characters from some of the animated feature films that originated from those countries started to appear in the World Showcase Pavilion. So it is admirable that once that decision was made, it was done in a very thoughtful manner and in a way that was unique to Epcot. So now the pictures that you get there, the experience that you have with the characters is different from what you would have if you met them at the Magic Kingdom or Disney's Hollywood Studios or Disney's Animal Kingdom.
Yeah, now you had mentioned the early days with Walt and the characters, but the early days of Disneyland is fascinating because I think those of us who, and by the way, I'm going to be playing devil's advocate throughout this episode because I just find all sides of this to be so interesting, but I feel like the conversation is about today. It's IP overdrive and there's too much of it and all this stuff. But it's fascinating to think back at opening Disneyland, where we had Adventureland, which was, originally going to be named True Life Adventureland after his True Life Adventure short films. Frontierland was essentially a place to advertise Davy Crockett. There was 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea over in Tomorrowland, Snow White and many others over in Fantasyland. And the question is, why is this such a conversation today if it was there from the very beginning in Walt's parks?
Well, that's something that I've always found amusing, especially in the kind of contentious days of the internet, where it's like, Walt wouldn't have stood for this, and, I don't like this, and I don't like that, and it was never this way, when, to your point, it's been precisely that way from the very beginning. I think my personal belief is that Walt had extremely sincere intentions with the creation and development of Disneyland. Today, you would look at it and say, oh, this company's looking to cash in on their films and TV shows. Anyone that knows anything about Walt Disney knew that was never a motivation for anything. He sincerely wanted to do something new and different and remove the screen that separated his audience from his films and television shows and allow them to live it. So all of that was very sincere. And in those early days, his characters, if you will, or the characters that we think of when we think of Disney characters, primarily, if not exclusively, resided in Fantasyland. Frontierland, you mentioned, and this is maybe as part of the devil's advocate role, you said, oh, it was an advertisement for Davy Crockett. I don't think so. I think what he was trying to do there was just celebrate one of the most beloved genres in film and on television at the time, the Western. We don't think of it that way anymore because the Western doesn't occupy the same place in the zeitgeist as it used to. So I think he was just sincerely trying to bring the Western to life as a genre. And in addition to that, he obviously brought things to life that he was deeply interested in himself, such as his own boyhood in Marceline, Missouri on Main Street, USA, and his own fascination with futurism and the world of tomorrow in Tomorrowland. And same thing with Adventureland. Not only did that capture, I mean, yes, primarily I think it stems from True Life Adventures, his own series. But it also attempted to capitalize on adventure films, jungle films. I mean, the Jungle Cruise is directly inspired by the African Queen, including the original design of the boats themselves. So I do think that every area of Disneyland was extremely sincerely motivated. And then as time went on and the characters just progressively became more and more beloved over the years, I think that's when you started to see them show up in so many other places, because that's really what the guests demanded. So it's easy to look at it as, over commercialization and some kind of cash grab. But in the early days, it was incredibly sincere. And then as time went on, I think it was in response to guest demand. And then it's interesting to me, what he did with Disneyland in the early days, because, originally the characters, they had to lease those costumes from the Ice Capades. So it's like everything was so new in those days. I mean, much has been said about the fact that it's the world's first theme park. And I'm reminded of something that Harriet Burns told me when I interviewed her for some of my books, where again and again, the same phrase came up. Well, it had never been done before. We had never built a tiki bird before. We didn't know how to do that. So you would just go down to the craft store and buy materials that, look like feathers. And, and I think that applies to the entire park. It was, another good example is just sort of farming out not only retail locations, but food and beverage locations to outside lessees. Because that was just, they didn't know anything about that business. They didn't know anything about anything when it came to running a theme park. The entire thing was new. So you can imagine why they would bring in these outside experts, if you will, who were in those businesses to run them at Disneyland. And then as they got more confident and the years went by, they realized, well, we're not going to, farm all this out. We're going to do it ourselves. And not only as a means of garnering more revenue, but also it had everything to do with quality control. It's the same reason they went into the hotel business when they developed Walt Disney World. They wanted to control quality and the Disney standard more than anything else.
That's so fascinating as well, because it went from, we don't want to outsource this so that we can control the quality, to today where I feel like it's a lot of going back to the outsourcing. My guess is to save money on, benefits and stuff like that. But it's so interesting how they kind of rode that wave of outsource to in-house back to outsource is kind of where we're living right now. And who knows if, at some point it'll go the other way again. I'm sure it will. Everything's cyclical, but that's kind of fascinating as well. You mentioned the Jungle Cruise, and I do want to touch on that for a second, since we just got the big announcement that Jungle Cruise for both Disneyland and Walt Disney World are getting a nice fresh update, more culturally sensitive. But it is interesting now, since we're talking about IP, considering this summer we have a Jungle Cruise movie with, huge stars in it, coming out in theaters, hopefully in theaters, and there is no mention. In fact, I think they deny the fact that this upgrade won't have anything to do with that film specifically. So how fascinating is that? We're having this conversation about, it feels like they're always pumping IP into stuff, but this current upgrade, I don't think that's happening.
Well, it's interesting because if you think back to when elements of the Pirates of the Caribbean films were first added to Pirates at Disneyland, that was, I think, 2006, which is 3 years after the first film came out, and it coincided with the release of Dead Man's Chest, roughly. So some of it has to do with these elements needing to prove themselves. I mean, I can remember being on the college program at Walt Disney World in the summer of 1989 and then coming back the following summer. And the talk was of The Little Mermaid, which, in November of '89 rejuvenated single-handedly Disney animation, and immediately talk turned to, well, when is this going to show up at Disneyland and at the Magic Kingdom? When's it going to be a dark ride? And then that same kind of conversation happened around Beauty and the Beast. And I can remember being a young guy working in the parks and literally hearing Dick Nunis say, well, it needs to earn it. And it was just such a almost touching thing to hear, because you don't think of it that way today when sometimes these experiences open day and date with the films, if they really get out ahead of it. So it's almost quaint now to think of, an old school Disney hand like Dick Nunis saying, well, yeah, I know it was successful, but it needs to earn it. Like its place in the Disney parks was this really special, exalted place that you wouldn't just waltz into. It needed to be earned, and that's always stuck with me. That he said that, but it has really carried through, where there aren't that many things that open day and date with the film, unless it's a short-term promotional type thing or an entertainment offering. But yeah, I do think, given what things cost today, you do want to make sure that it's embraced by the public, and not just for financial reasons, for experiential and emotional reasons, because you want to present something that really is going to mean something to people and resonate with people. So it makes, perfect sense in that regard. And heaven forbid you hitch your wagon to the wrong horse, and then setting aside the money that you spent on it, you might have opened something that there's going to be very little interest in, and you're stuck with it, for a while.
That's an interesting point, and it makes me actually think of Universal with the Jurassic Park ride, because I remember always hearing that attraction was being developed while the film was actually being made, and yet it didn't open until 3 years after the movie came out. So perhaps they were, investing in that development, but maybe they actually waited to see, hey, is this going to be a hit before they broke ground? I don't know specifically when they broke ground and that stuff, but that sounds like maybe that's what was going on in that case.
I do believe it was developed concurrently. I think the 3-year, air quotes, lag between the opening of the film and the opening of the river adventure in Hollywood has more to do with the gestation of a theme park attraction than anything else. And that 3 years is inclusive of being in development concurrently. So that says more about the length of time that it takes us to do one of these big e-ticket attractions than it does anything else. Because with that one, you never know. But given that it's dinosaurs and Steven Spielberg and Michael Crichton, I think they were probably fairly confident about that one from the beginning.
Listen, sometimes those ones that seem like, slam dunks don't always pan out that way. But yes, dinosaurs are definitely a win usually. Although speaking of, Dinosaur for Disney wasn't exactly the biggest hit, I guess, and The Good Dinosaur. But regardless, back to the parks, the first outside IP that Disney used that they didn't own for an attraction was Star Tours in the mid-'80s. And do you feel like this was a game changer for Disney in regards to the whole IP conversation? Was it, I was not even paying it. I was very, very, very young when this happened. So what was the conversation? Was it like, do people even think, well, wait a second, what is Star Tours doing here? Disney doesn't make that, or did they not care? Did they not think about that? What was that?
Well, I was around in that era. I was in junior high and high school when Michael Eisner and Frank Wells took over. And for them, I think it had more to do with, we need to be in business with the best in the business. And obviously, George Lucas was and still would be at the top of that list. And also, I think in their view, the Star Wars films and the Indiana Jones films in particular were essentially modern Disney films. The big distinction is that Disney wasn't making them, and that would soon change as well. But I do remember that being a conversation at the time. People just felt it was a natural fit, but the average person at that time could not tell you what studio put out what movie. And that doesn't necessarily mean they thought Star Wars was a Disney movie, but they wouldn't necessarily think twice about it because the fit was so appropriate. And I do think it was a game changer in any number of ways. It saw that, it proved that you could go out and license something and have it be a home run and have longtime Disney fans, not picket in the streets, but embrace it and love it. And as someone who rode Indiana Jones Adventure in its first month of operation back in 1995 on a business trip for Universal, oddly enough, I remember getting in line on Main Street, USA, for Indiana Jones Adventure.
Wow.
So there was definitely an embrace, certainly no resistance to, air quotes, outside IP being introduced to the parks. Now it's all academic because Disney owns Star Wars and Indiana Jones. But I think it had more to do with Michael and Frank wanting to be in collaboration with the best in the business. And certainly they saw Star Wars and Indiana Jones as more than natural fits with Disney and with Disneyland.
We would see that continue with Disney MGM Studios. The Great Movie Ride had a ton of IP in there that Disney had nothing to do with. Even the Twilight Zone being brought into the Tower of Terror is something that we don't see. It does feel like these days Disney either starts distancing themselves and removing those things, such as the removal of the Great Movie Ride, or they buy it in the case of Star Wars and even Pandora, Avatar at this point. So it is interesting that it feels like they do kind of want to own the stuff that's in their parks now. How do you feel about the parks using IP that they don't own in their parks, just licensing?
I have never had a problem with it, if for no other reason than 9 times out of 10, if one of these companies, whether it's Disney back in the day with Star Wars and Indy, or the MGM deal for Disney MGM Studios, or more specifically what Universal has done, ultimately they're going after a property because they think it's going to resonate with the guests. So I don't see how you could be against it, because ultimately the audience is going to win, because you're not going to go out and license, Barney Miller live on stage. There's a dated reference for you. But, it's going to be one of these blockbuster properties like Men in Black or Avatar, or, the list goes on. Going back to Disney MGM Studios, that I think the reasoning was twofold. One, I do believe Michael and Frank felt that, particularly on the live action side, Disney didn't necessarily have the depth of titles and characters to really draw from. But more to the point, I do know that there was a key creative decision made very early on that they wanted to depict all of Hollywood and all of filmmaking and the entire history of the industry, which obviously no one studio is going to be able to do. And the deal that they struck specifically with MGM, and then individual licensing agreements like for Casablanca with Warner Brothers, or Alien with Fox, that was an effort to depict all genres, the entirety of the Hollywood and movie experience. So it was really a twofold decision. It's funny looking back on it now, it's easy to say, because I do think they also wanted to bolster the name, the Disney MGM Studios. It's almost like they felt they needed that for additional legitimacy and credibility. And if you think back to the golden age of Hollywood, when MGM was the premier studio, even as late as the 80s, it probably made more sense to do that. Looking back on it now, you're like, what are you, crazy? Call it the Walt Disney Studios Florida. You're done. You don't need anything else. But it was those two things. I think deepening the bench that they could pull from, as well as that added legitimacy and the desire to represent all of Hollywood.
Yeah, it's the Great Movie Ride is one of those things. It actually goes back to the whole Hitchcock example I was giving you, where, people, I'm so upset that attraction's gone. I'm still not over it. I never will be. Mickey and Minnie is great. The Runaway Railway is great. It should have gone to the animation courtyard in that same park, but I digress. But, the argument of, well, these are old things that people don't know anymore and don't care about, it's my argument is always, yeah, but don't people look at these things and get curious and say, well, I'm going to go home and watch that movie? Because I know that's what it was with Hitchcock for me. I had no idea who Hitchcock was. I had never seen Psycho. I didn't even know the end of the movie when I went to that attraction. And one of the first things I did when I got home was rent that movie and fall in love with it. And so that was always the argument with me, for me, with, the Great Movie Ride, and people saying, oh, well, it's outdated. It's like, well, I mean, doesn't anybody have interest in learning from the past anymore? And I don't know. This is like old man talk in my mind, I guess. But is it, I don't know. I always wonder, do guests want that and the parks just don't give it to them because they feel like the easy way out is to just give them what they think they want? Or do people genuinely not want that anymore? What do you think?
I don't think it's because people don't want it anymore, because contrary to what market researchers will tell you, I think the consumer, whether they're going to a theme park or buying an iPhone or whatever, they don't know they don't know how good it could be. They don't know what they want until you show it to them. And then they want it really bad, So my view is you could absolutely still do a killer making of experience. And as long as it's good and it's a good match with the property and you're illuminating something about the filmmaking process, I absolutely think people would be all over it. The Great Movie Ride has a special place in my heart because I got to rewrite the script for it back in 2003. In fact, I think my script was there for the majority of the time it was running. We didn't get to do everything we wanted to do. It was supposed to be step one of a much larger reinvention. We were going to introduce props and even more interactivity with the guide. And we had to curtail some of what we were doing due to time and money, the usual suspects. But I think personally, I would have loved to have seen the attraction updated with new film properties, new effects. Can you imagine, especially with what we have today, removing the large, slow-moving ride vehicles with its smaller, nimble, trackless vehicles like at Rise of the Resistance and Runaway Railway? The possibilities are endless. But, that ship has sailed. But, I myself worked on a number of different concepts for updates to the Great Movie Ride. And then I also think that there was the issue of the licensing agreements, because it gets complicated, it gets expensive. And then, of course, Disney, with the acquisitions of Pixar, Marvel, and Lucasfilm, in addition to what they were doing at their own studio, they didn't really need to do that. They didn't need to go outside anymore. So I think it was a combination of all of those things.
That's my aggravation the most, is I'm like, now that you own half of Hollywood. You don't even need to license stuff anymore. You can just put all the properties you own in there. I mean, with the Fox library and Lucasfilm and Disney, don't tell me you couldn't have filled that attraction. So we might have to do a whole other episode sometime about some of your Great Movie Ride ideas, because, gosh, I missed that attraction. In any case, let's talk about, for a minute, the rides. We're talking about IPs being licensed and being used to create attractions, but we also hit this trend of rides that were original ideas being made into movies, stuff like Pirates of the Caribbean, The Haunted Mansion, The Country Bears, and so on. And that is this whole other thing that, I don't know, how do you feel about that? That's a weird thing, especially when it becomes part of the attraction, like Pirates,
Yeah, Pirates was this weird sort of Mobius strip of content reinvention and adaptation. I think that in any of those cases, it's a testament to the power of the source material and the fact that those were all original stories, which, once upon a time were much more common, because without original stories in theme parks, you don't have Pirates of the Caribbean, The Haunted Mansion, Big Thunder Mountain Railroad, Space Mountain, Jungle Cruise. But, the interesting thing with pretty much every example I just mentioned, all of them are representative of a major film genre: science fiction, the Western, adventure, with some of the things we talked about earlier. So they were related to film in a way. in terms of their genesis. But of course, it was the original storytelling, from characters to the locations to the music. You two of those attractions, you got two of the most beloved theme park songs of all time. That's what made them so rich and, I think, suitable for adaptations into films. And in the case of something like Pirates of the Caribbean in particular, when I was doing my interviews for my book on the attraction and the film series, Ted Elliott and Terry Rossio said the key to unlocking what would make a good Pirates of the Caribbean movie was the supernatural element that derived directly from the attraction. They said because without that, you're just doing Errol Flynn, and which is arguably one of the reasons pirate movies weren't being made anymore, because the sort of typical swashbuckler had just fallen out of favor. But the notion of pirates attempting to put a treasure back as opposed to stealing it because they turned into skeletons in the moonlight, that's what made that movie work. The supernatural element was what gave it the difference, the edge that made it what it was. And that came directly from the ride. They said that to me repeatedly. And even if there wasn't as much of the ride in the film as some fans would have wanted or expected, my hat was off to them for using the ride, the source material, as inspiration to tell a bigger, broader story. And if you start thinking about that supernatural component, then you realize, man, that attraction is all over that franchise, especially the first film. And then the other interesting thing they said to me was they consciously at a certain point said, okay, man, we got one shot at this. So any and everything you want to see in a pirate movie, we need to put in this movie. And then, of course, it just blows the roof off of theaters all over the world. And then they're like, we want to do two more and make it a trilogy. And they're like, oh my gosh, we used everything the first time around. And I was in their office when they had the 3x5 cards up for 2 and 3, and you saw Kraken, New Orleans, the Blue Bayou, like all of this, anything remaining from the attraction that didn't make it into the first one was there, along with every other seafaring trope you could think of, sea monsters, mermaids, the whole nine.
That's so funny. How do you feel about the movie ending up in the attraction? Do you like the idea of, including Jack Sparrow? Or is it like, no, why are you touching this thing that was inspired, this great product, but like by touching it, you're changing what inspired? I've
talked about this a lot, as you might imagine, over the years. And to this day, the genius of what that team did, and I worked on it a little bit, primarily like from a graphics perspective and adding some nomenclature and things. So by no means, was I heavily involved with the story. But the genius of what that project team did was they consciously set out to make everything they were going to put in, and this sounds obvious when you say it, but I mean it in a very specific way. It's additive, which means we're not going in and changing things because it's one of the crown jewels. We're going to add things. So we're not going to take away anything that you already love. The only thing you could point to really is, okay, they took out the captain, who was clearly inspired by Blackbeard, replaced him with Barbossa. But the character still serves the same function. They actually look somewhat similar, and they're delivering most of the same dialogue. So the additions of Captain Jack himself were ultimately fairly subtle and didn't really or didn't at all detract from what was there. It was just additive. And I think that was why it succeeded and why it was embraced the way it was. And in terms of the motivation to do it, again, not capitalization or commercialization, because I talked about this with the team. They said, we found that we really had a problem because after the success of that first film, which was a global hit, you now had generations of people coming into the park for the first time whose first frame of reference when you say Pirates of the Caribbean is that film, not the ride. So those people, and I'm sure a lot of them were kids, younger, were now disappointed because they're going on this giant e-ticket attraction called Pirates of the Caribbean, and there's no Captain Jack, no Barbossa, no nothing. So in a way, it was an effort to address that, something that was potentially odd as it may seem, given that it was a classic, it was an attempt to address a potential dissatisfier. So I think when you consider that and then consider their sort of additive philosophy, that's what made that enhancement a winner.
Disney CEO Bob Chapek has been quoted as saying the future for the parks, particularly Epcot he was talking about, need to be focused on more Disney, more family, more relevant, and more timeless. Now, the thing that I find interesting about this is, isn't IP kind of the opposite of timeless in a lot of cases?
I think it depends on the situation. It depends on the property. And that actually circles back to the Dick Nunis quote, it needs to earn it. If a film really captures the public's imagination, it's pretty much halfway to becoming timeless. Looking back on it now, you could argue that Little Mermaid, Beauty and the Beast, Aladdin, and Lion King in particular were timeless from the day they were released because they really fit into that classic Disney mold. Even going all the way back to Walt, he tried to avoid slang and references to real things that were going on in the world, or what we would now call pop cultural references. Aladdin was a little different, but it was purposeful because the genie was that kind of omniscient, time agnostic character, right? But you could argue that those modern classics were timeless from the moment that they were made. So that, I think, makes it completely valid to want to get them into the parks because people want it. They expect it. And even if it took less time than Dick Nunis may have forecasted, they have, in fact, earned it. Because I know my kids, the Little Mermaid attraction is a must-do every time we're in the Magic Kingdom. So to them, it's just part of the Magic Kingdom experience, where for me, it's, it's part of the new movies, even though it's 30-some years old at this point.
I know. It blows my mind how old that movie is at this point, but it's remarkable. And, the thing that I find so interesting about them is songs from them, especially like when you think of Be Our Guest in Beauty and the Beast. That song is it's When You Wish Upon a Star, you know what I mean? Like, it's in the Disney commercials. It's not necessarily just associated with Beauty and the Beast anymore. That's the song that you hear in the fireworks show and the song that you hear in the commercials because it's just classic Disney.
And that was from day one. I remember that I was a sophomore in college, and I remember driving out to the theater from my school to go see Little Mermaid, and just having a smile plastered on my face from beginning to end. And the moment I heard Under the Sea, it was a classic in my mind. Yeah. And, Mermaid, Beauty and the Beast, Aladdin, and Lion King are filled with those songs. And each one of those movies have produced songs that are just as much an anthem as When You Wish Upon a Star, or some of the classics that we associate with those earlier ages of animation. But and it's weird because the older you get and the more eras you live through, you start to see things repeating themselves, and you realize that I still look at the new princesses, even though they're now decades old, differently than I do Snow White, Cinderella, Aurora. It's just, I still separate them in my mind, but that's just because I've lived that long. And not that I was alive in the 30s, but like I grew up when there were Disney reissues every single year, and I got to experience all of Walt's movies in the theater, which gave them that added sort of weight.
One of the things that I find really interesting when it comes to IP is, with live action movies, there's celebrities attached to them. And we live in a world where overnight a celebrity can become a villain in real life, with one tweet. And I find this really fascinating. And I don't know, are these conversations had behind closed doors? Because, there can literally be one celebrity that is featured in an attraction that is brand new based on a huge IP that could just kill it overnight. Is that something that the industry's talking about at all?
I think it comes up probably not in the way you would think. It's just one of those things that sort of lurks in the background because like I experienced it a little bit on the Jimmy Fallon ride at Universal, where I had a conversation with him, and I was joking, but we were talking about some kind of potential cameo in the ride, and Jimmy goes, yeah, well, what if something happens and there's a scandal and then they're in the ride? And I kind of looked at him and I said, I'm more worried about you. I'm worried that in a year or two I got to digitally replace you with Seth Meyers. And he started laughing. He knew I was kidding. But yeah, I mean, we live in a world now where one wrong tweet, one wrong whatever, and you're canceled. And then there's this ripple effect, across the entire industry. Oh, we got to pull dolls off shelves. We've got to redo this film. We've got to redo that ride. But it's one of those things. And I think that's also gone through cycles as well, because like in the early days of Disney animation, it was all about who was best for the part. And then Walt got into a phase in the 60s where he started to chase celebrity talent a little bit more. Hence, with the voice talents of Phil Harris and Sebastian Cabot, it became more of a thing. Then that receded again. Then it came back again, and I think as long as, to me, it's like, if you can match a celebrity to the character really well, like, and I'll use an example that didn't happen, but like they wanted Jack Nicholson for Hades in Hercules. And I'm like, oh my gosh, I want to see that movie, but that's perfect casting, even though you could argue it's also blatant stunt casting. I think a lot of us, certainly in theme park design, but also in film and television, believe it or not, there is a great sincerity, in what we're doing. And no one wants to make something bad or irritate people. No one makes a decision going, whoa, this will really tick people off. Let's do it. But it's like there are trends, and, you could potentially follow those trends at your peril. Disney has always tended to embrace timelessness and nostalgia, much more than Universal, which prides itself on being very of the moment and current. But
it wasn't always that way with Universal. When Universal opened, once again, back to Hitchcock, he certainly wasn't current.
Right.
King Kong wasn't current. I mean, Jaws was over a decade before. So I find that really fascinating with Universal, because I have such a soft spot in my heart for, like, 1990s Universal Studios Florida. Oh my gosh. And to this day, like, even just walking over to the E.T. adventure and seeing the colors that soundstage is painted, which is like the original park colors, that makes me weepy. I'm like, gosh. And so it's so frustrating to me, where I'm like, yeah, I get that you want to bring in the new stuff, and I'm not saying nothing should ever change. I get it. It's not a museum, but I don't understand the grand desire to replace things just because it's older. I don't get that. I never will.
And a lot of us have tried to gently make that argument, and for very valid reasons, because what I've tried to point out, and not just on the creative side, but also on the park side with the operation, is what you have to understand, Universal, is nostalgia is not necessarily a dirty word for you. I know you associate it with Disney, but what you need to start thinking about is the fact that Universal films, and by the way, Universal parks, are now old enough to have built up their own nostalgic feeling among their guests and their audience. I was on one project a couple of years ago where I found myself conducting a lot of focus groups with, average guests, some annual pass holders, but, went to New Jersey and just talked to people that they got in off the street. And the message I got loud and clear was, no, we want some of that. I want to see the Blues Brothers and E.T. and Back to the Future and Jaws. And I think that's a testament to the fact that a company, a studio like Universal, has built up its own sense of nostalgia and timelessness with its own properties simply by virtue of how long they've been around, the studio and now the parks. Because, Universal Studios Florida is now going to be 31 this year, so it's got its own sense of nostalgia among the people that come to the park. That doesn't mean you do everything that way, but I personally think that if the greatest thing Universal could do is a killer e-ticket new version of Back to the Future, for example, you'd have lines down I-4 for that.
1,000,000,000%. And, who seems to have gotten the note at Universal is merchandising. Because you'll have noticed, at least I guess for the 30th anniversary perhaps, but they really pumped out some cool merch with those original opening attractions that are all gone. And from what I saw on the Twitterverse and stuff, they were flying off the store shelves.
Yep, I bought the whole set of the glasses. The poster's amazing because it recalls those billboards on I-4, those great three-dimensional billboards. But yeah, both companies, Disney, you saw it when the original Walt Disney World logo and that font started to come back, and Epcot original font, Epcot Center, started to come back because it's a huge part of people's lives, and they want to hang on to that. They want to celebrate that.
Yeah, now with so much IP everywhere, and it sounds like you're somewhere in the middle, like you recognize IP isn't this dirty word, but it also feels like it needs some balance. I feel like it's definitely skewing more in the direction of IP heavy these days. I don't know if I assume you agree, yes?
Yeah, and here's the thing, because it is a complicated question. As a creator and as someone who works in theme park design, I look at IP and original storytelling very much like I do the Force. It needs to be in balance. And a lot of us would say, man, I'm really hungry to have a crack at an original story. I want to do a Big Thunder, or a Space Mountain, or God, heaven help me, a Haunted Mansion. In fact, some of the freelance work I've been doing since leaving Universal has been in original storytelling, and I cannot tell you how amazing and refreshing it is. That said, the thing about IP is, for the most part, by far and away, it is what people want. And the second big thing is theme parks appear to be going the way of the entire rest of show business. Because as difficult as it is for a creative to say this, it is show business, not show. The business part has to be there. And we live in a world now, specifically in film, and you're totally seeing this. It's been exacerbated by the pandemic and the closure of theaters. But film was already trending toward the only thing you're going to see in movie theaters is capes and lightsabers and properties that people know and love. And that largely has to do with economics. Movies have become just so expensive to make that the studios want the security of familiar characters and stories so they know people are going to go. So things like the mid-range, heaven forbid you should want to see When Harry Met Sally today. It wouldn't get made, or it would go to Netflix. So
it would go to Netflix, yeah.
Mid-budget romantic comedies, mid-budget dramas, those are all going to streaming. And I think, especially with the pandemic, it's expedited what was happening anyway. Because I don't think we're ever going to reach a time where you don't want to see Avengers Endgame on the biggest screen you can find with the best sound system you can find. But look at examples. I read a book a couple of years ago about this very issue that used Adam Sandler and Will Smith as case studies. Both of them have gotten second leases on their careers with Netflix because Netflix is doing those mid-budget Adam Sandler comedies that might be harder to make for theatrical now. And Will Smith, I personally think, is still a big, great, charismatic star who could absolutely anchor a tentpole film. But even he has seen the handwriting on the wall and has kind of aligned himself with Netflix and has done some great movies for them. But it has everything to do with the budget and the subject matter and what they think. What they think is going to get people into theater seats, and I think back to my the summer of '89 that I spent on the college program at Walt Disney World, and I just think of the films that came out that summer and the diversity.
Honey, I Shrunk the Kids.
Honey, I Shrunk the Kids. I mean, you had your blockbusters. You had Batman, Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade, Ghostbusters 2, Star Trek 5, Lethal Weapon 2. But you also had Field of Dreams, Dead Poets Society, Parenthood, When Harry Met Sally, The Abyss. All just this wonderful array of comedies and dramas and blockbusters, all in the movie theater. And I saw When Harry Met Sally and Parenthood multiple times in the theater, just like I would Indiana Jones.
Yeah, it's interesting because I guess I have an old soul, but I tend to gravitate toward those mid-budget films. Honestly, like superhero stuff doesn't do it for me. Don't get me wrong, I get very excited about a Jurassic World or something like that, but I really like small character-driven movies, and it does bum me out to think that you won't see them on the big screen. And like you were talking about with the pandemic, I think it's going to even multiply it even more, this whole event movie sort of thing, because let's face it, with multiplexes kind of not doing so well, and then live theater not doing so well, and a lot of them won't be reopening very quickly, I think it's going to go back to a time I remember my mom talking about where she used to go to these grandiose live theaters and they showed movies there.
Yeah, the movie
and
palaces.
It was an event.
Yeah.
It was
people
an
used
event.
to dress up to go to the movies, and you had the organist. They did it at the El Cap, on Hollywood Boulevard, where it was an event, and films were shown in palaces. And
I think that's what we're going to go back to for a while. I really think, especially if the multiplexes don't survive and the theaters with live entertainment stay empty for a while, I think we're going to see those grand events happening in movie houses and palaces again. And that's interesting to me. Like, that partially excites me, and it also breaks my heart because I'm such a live theater fan. But it's interesting. It's all really interesting. And yeah, IP isn't going anywhere. That is for certain.
And I don't think movie theaters are either. You read these dire articles. Oh, film is dead. Movie theaters are dead. It's like, no, they're not dead. The pandemic didn't kill anything. It just expedited a number of things that were already happening and probably sped them up by years, I would say. And you saw it early on with DreamWorks and Trolls. And then you saw it with what Disney did with Mulan, and there are these various experiments. Like, okay, it's going to be in the theaters and on streaming, or it's going to be on streaming but an extra $30. So you're going to see all of these different approaches. But I had been saying with my friends, years ago, there will come a day when I will be able to go to the theater on Friday night and see Star Wars episode whatever, and then buy the Blu-ray on my way home, or digitally download it on the exact same day. Because that's what I have every intention of doing. I'm going to do it with the new Disney animated film in March or whatever it is, Raya. I'm going to go see it in the theater. Absolutely. And as a film fan, I'm crushed because I'm like, I'm just going to lose it if Bond is delayed one more time. I want Bond, I want Black Widow. And then the problem is frustration starts to set in where you're like, okay, I don't even care anymore. I'll go out and I'll buy a bigger TV. I don't care, $30, $40. I want to see James Bond and Rami Malek, and I want it now. I want to see Black Widow. We've waited too long, and I'm tired of waiting. But I think with the Marvel films in particular, it's like that's about as close to a sure thing as you're going to get. So I can totally understand why that could be one of the holdouts where they're like, no, this is going into the theater and we'll wait it out,
Yeah, I get it. So back to the theme parks with the IPs, how do you think we get that balance again with, because honestly, whenever I think when was the last original attraction in a theme park, and I could be totally wrong, but the one that always comes to mind is Soarin' at Disney California Adventure. I think there might have been some after that, and I feel like people have mentioned to me ones that came later, but I don't know. I always go back to Soarin'. The fact that it's so hard for me to even think of one. Well,
it's funny. It's funny you say that because when you first mentioned it, I'm like, oh, geez, what would it be? And then I realized, it's Mystic Manor. It's because I don't know that Hong Kong Disneyland is top of mind for most fans, not for any other reason than it's just not necessarily the first one you think. But Mystic Manor, and I interviewed Robert Coltrane for the latest revision of my Haunted Mansion book to incorporate Mystic Manor, and he was talking about how they decided to take the resources that they were given, the capital, and do a couple of smaller things rather than one giant blockbuster e-ticket, and they still managed to do quite a bit. And the name is escaping me of the adjacent Western themed area in that ride, but they got that. They got Mystic Manor. All of those were original stories. I think they did a Toy Story thing, obviously that wasn't, but that's a fairly recent example of original storytelling in a Disney theme park that was absolutely embraced by the audience. People love Mystic Manor and Sir Henry Mystic and the expansion of the Society of Explorers and Adventurers. It's still there, and you'll see it in little bits and pieces. And I think Mystic Manor and that Hong Kong expansion work of 5 or 6 years ago, whatever it was, is a testament to the fact that original storytelling absolutely can and does still work. And hopefully, as time goes on, you'll see more of that balance. You mentioned Epcot earlier. Epcot has a number of difficult conceptual issues to navigate in that it's already an adaptation of the original intent, which of course was City of the Future. So you're already dealing with an adaptation of the original spark of the idea. And at that time, the concept of a World's Fair was still very much a thing and very relevant and something that people got and were excited about. So the notion of a permanent World's Fair style park made absolute sense. And everything that they were trying to do in Future World and World Showcase, it dealt so much in reality that IP wasn't really an issue at all beyond that early "Where's Mickey Mouse" reaction.
Yeah.
So Epcot, as the decades have gone on, has just, I think, had to adapt to different changing audience tastes. Because I remember years ago saying, oh man, I think we've seen the last of those big pavilions dedicated to a single story. World of Motion, Horizons, Spaceship Earth is the last holdout. And I think that has to do with the fact that those were World's Fair experiences. These monolithic buildings with sweeping stories that dealt with an important subject. That's just not the world we live in anymore. And that combined with the general reliance on IP and all of entertainment, all of that is contributing to what you're seeing. I'm actually very cheered by what I see happening at Epcot, because they do seem to very much have their hearts in the right place when it comes to preserving as much of that original spirit and intent of the park as they can. They're just using Disney vehicles, if you will, to do it. Characters and stories that people know and love to deliver the Epcot message in a slightly different way. But it's still very important to them to keep Epcot.
Yeah, and I mean, they're going to have to keep creating original stuff in the future, or else they're not going to have stuff to base movies on.
Exactly. It's like, it's got to come from somewhere.
At some point, it's going to come back. This has been a super, super fascinating conversation, but let's get to some trivia.
Do you know the answer? Get your brain gears churning and play along. It's trivia time.
Alrighty, Jason, do you want to hit me with the trivia question first, or shall I hit you?
I don't know. Maybe you hit me first, because I think I have a good one. Then I can recover.
All right. So which opening day pavilion in Epcot's Future World currently features 3 attractions that have 0 connection to an IP?
Are you saying opening day or currently?
Which opening day pavilion?
Oh, which opening day pavilion?
In Epcot's Future World currently features 3 attractions that have 0 connection to an IP.
Right. Well, I want to say Spaceship Earth, but I can't. I don't know the number if you add them up, because you've got the ride and then you've got the post show test tracks. You've got multiple.
It's going to be over by the seas. What else is over there?
Oh, the land.
The land, yeah, that has Soarin' Around the World, Living with the Land, and Awesome Planet in there. So those are 3 non-IP related attractions in an opening day pavilion at Epcot. So, hey, it's living at Epcot a little bit.
Exactly.
I don't know,
and
who
we're
knows,
living
maybe
with
we'll
the
get some... For a while there, though, we did have that Lion King Circle of Life show.
Right, but then they changed it out with the new film, and that's what tipped it to being IP free.
Yeah, so there we go.
They can have a little medallion on the side of the show building if we ever get there. This attraction is IP free.
Exactly.
It's gluten free and IP free.
All right, what's your trivia question for me?
Okay, I decided to go with something that's related to Disney IP and non-Disney potentially licensed IP, what do the Three Little Pigs and The Legend of Zelda have in common?
Oh my gosh, like the video game, The Legend of Zelda?
Yeah, which I know nothing about, by the way.
I don't either. I am not a gamer. I don't. Do they use the song in The Legend of Zelda or something? Who's afraid of the big bad wolf?
It is related to the song. Okay, you obviously, and this was a tough one, and I don't know how it occurred to me today when I was walking the dog, because I was stressed about this. What they share in common, and maybe I'm stretching, is the ocarina. Because one of the most beloved Zelda games and stories is, I think, the Ocarina of Time. It's an instrument.
Okay.
And what it has
like the flute.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
So what it has to do with the Three Little Pigs was they were composing the song and didn't know how to end the chorus. And Pinto Colvig, an animator who obviously is more well-known for being Goofy's voice, played the da-da-da-da-da on an ocarina that he happened to have with him. So the ocarina links the Three Little Pigs and a beloved Disney song and The Legend of Zelda. You're welcome.
There we go. I would have never, ever known. So thank you for the fun factoid. Jason, this has been an absolute pleasure. Before we go, why don't you plug whatever you want to plug? Any books you want to plug, or your social media or website or whatever?
Well, I am currently working on a new book for Theme Park Press called Pirates of the Caribbean, Imagineering a Disney Classic. It's just basically a re-examination of the entire history of pirates, taking it all the way through Shanghai. The original book that I did for Disney's been out of print for quite some time, and I've gotten so many requests over the years, and finally a request from Theme Park Press saying, hey, would you mind doing a new take on pirates for us? Because the audience is definitely out there. So I'm working on that, and then with the same publisher, I'm going to follow that up, as pretentious as this may sound, with a combination memoir how-to book. It occurred to me that even at, I'm not done yet by any means, but at my age and experience level, I think I've accumulated enough stories and anecdotes that would be entertaining to people, combined with all of the mentorship that I've done over the years and speaking to college classes. I spoke to UCF earlier tonight. I think I have a lot to say about the art of theme design and storytelling in theme parks that could be of benefit to young people setting out looking for a career in the business. So that's tentatively titled Adventures in the Theme Trade, From the Dawn of Hollywood East to the Twilight of the Imagineers. So a combo memoir, how-to book. And then I've been doing a lot of freelance and consulting work, primarily with Storyland Studios out of California. And I think I'm going to be looking forward to a future with them. So I'm excited about that. And did a Christmas show for SeaWorld that was a lot of fun and pretty well received. So it's been fun. It's an exciting new chapter. And I've gotten to do a little original storytelling of my own. So things are looking really bright and interesting, given the diversity of things that I have in front of me. So I'm really excited about it.
That's excellent. Well, thank you so much for coming on the show and sharing all of your insight. This has been so great.
Yep, no, I've had a blast, and it's a great subject, and it's a subject that isn't going away. So the debate will continue.
I hope you all enjoyed today's conversation. On the last couple of episodes, we talked about the announced plans for Walt Disney World's 50th anniversary, along with the surprising announcement from recently retired Imagineer Joe Rohde about his next career move. Speaking of Joe Rohde, we also recently had an entire episode all about his career with Walt Disney Imagineering. On the next episode, we have some more Disney news and conversations coming your way. The easiest way to make sure you don't miss any of the magic is by subscribing to Disney Coast to Coast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you listen to podcasts. Wherever you search, don't forget, it's Disney with a Z, Coast to Coast. You can find any links mentioned in this episode along with ways to connect with today's guest by checking out the show notes at DisneyCoastToCoast.com, or you can find a link to the show notes in this episode's description. Help ensure more free episodes of the podcast and gain rewards by joining the DCTC community over at patreon.com/DisneyCTC. And don't forget to leave a voicemail at 818-860-2569 to share your thoughts on today's conversation for the chance to be heard on a future episode. Once again, that's 818-860-2569, or find the number in this episode's description along with a link for some free gifts from me to you. Other than that, folks, have a magical day. Bye! Thanks! for listening to Disney Coast to Coast. Have a magical day.
Disney Coast to Coast is produced and hosted by Jeff DePauli. Learn more about the podcast and become a supporter at DisneyCoastToCoast.com. This podcast is part of the DePodcast Network. Learn more about this show, plus find more quality and entertaining podcasts at DePodcastNetwork.com. That's DEPodcastNetwork.com.